Let me, Madam President, speak to an issue which has been raised this morning, which is timely and critically important. The President tweeted last week to the country, "All is well." As we were teetering on the verge of war with Iran, he tweeted, "All is well." But now details have come to light, and it is clear that all is not well. U.S. service members at Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq faced a sustained hour-and-a-half of Iranian retaliatory attacks last week, a barrage described by one of the most senior U.S. commanders on the base as designed and organized to inflict as many casualties as possible. Contrary to the tweet by our president that all is well, reports from witnesses suggest that despite heroic planning, we were in fact very fortunate, if not lucky, that none of our U.S. personnel were killed, which gets me to the issue that needs to be brought before the Senate, one that goes to the heart of this Senate's critical, often neglected constitutional responsibility. It's not whether Iranian General Soleimani was an enemy with American blood on his hands. That's a fact, but it's too simplistic to stop there. We've known that fact for a long time. Previous presidents of both political parties have known General Soleimani's background. It's not in dispute, and it's a distraction to stop with that conversation. The real question was whether President Trump, when he made the decision to target General Soleimani, considered the possibility that it would quickly escalate into a much larger confrontation with Iran, a possibility of a war, a distinct possibility and one never authorized by Congress. Based on the administration's briefing last week, which I sat through, I doubt if even they think they need congressional authorization to ask our sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters, to participate in another war in the Middle East. The first question asked at the briefing, which was attended by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first question asked by Senator McConnell was whether or not there was need for authorization under the War Powers Act before the United States continued to have its conflict with Iran. The answer that came from the Secretary of Defense was no. No authorization necessary. And he went on to say that he thought even the debate over authorization could be unsettling and troublesome for our troops if it appeared that we were even uncertain as to whether or not we were ready to go to war. Based on that briefing, I doubt that this administration believes any congressional authorization is needed for the military action that has been taken or might even be contemplated. Quite simply, the fact that the Senate has not exercised its constitutional right, authority, and responsibility to determine whether we should go to war with Iran troubles me. I'm deeply concerned that if Iran retaliates further, or if the president decides to escalate the confrontation, this chamber will not even recognize, let alone act on its constitutional responsibility under Article 1, Section 8. That's why I've joined my colleague and friend, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, in invoking the War Powers Act, a law passed over President Nixon's veto after presidents of both parties deliberately misled the American people on the Vietnam War. It is hard for those who did not live during that era to appreciate what that war did to this nation. First and foremost, cost us almost 50,000 American lives, hundreds of thousands of Americans injured, men and women in uniform who bravely served our country, giving their lives and coming home with the scars that they carried for a lifetime. The billions of dollars that were spent, the involvement in that war that divided this country at its core is hard to put in words in just a few moments. At the end of it, though, Congress realized that it had failed its own responsibility to even declare a war against Vietnam. And so we passed the War Powers Act, setting up a process that said we're not going to let that happen again. The American people will participate in any future decisions about whether we go to war, and they'll do it through their elected congressmen and elected senators. That War Powers Act passed the Congress, was sent to President Nixon. He vetoed it. It said, we don't want to give that additional authority to Congress. In a rare, rare moment, Congress overrode the veto of President Nixon, and the War Powers Act is now the law of the land. That War Powers Act, I believe, applies to the current situation that is escalating with Iran, and that's why I've joined Senator Kaine in his invoking the War Powers Resolution. What I find particularly troubling about the administration's march to war in Iran is that its own actions have contributed to the current tension and problems we have with Iran. Before taking office, Iran's nuclear weapons program was halted because of an historic agreement President Obama negotiated in cooperation with our allies in Europe, as well as China and Russia. President Obama negotiated a treaty requiring for international inspectors to be on the ground in Iran to make certain they lived up to its terms. Iran, of course, was not happy about these inspectors, but accepted them. And on several different occasions, we had representatives of those inspectors come and say, yes, they had virtual unlimited access to Iran to make certain they didn't violate the nuclear agreement. Iran continued in its malign behaviors in the region, but containment was easier without the threat of an Iranian nuclear bomb. President Trump said during the campaign that the first thing he would do is to eliminate that international agreement requiring international inspectors that stopped Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. It made no sense. It made no sense for the president to take his position that he did, but that's the position that he announced in the campaign, and that's exactly what he did after he was elected president. He withdrew the United States from this agreement that stopped Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Then he increased sanctions on Iran, and the tensions between our countries grew. The president pursued a policy very difficult to explain, if not justify, of regime change, trying to flatter on one day and then confront on the next day. He proposed to meet with the president of Iran, Rouhani, to negotiate a supposedly bigger deal, better deal. Then he would threaten Iran militarily, and then he would tighten sanctions soon after. These efforts went nowhere except to increase tensions between the United States and Iran. Iran lashed out at American interest. We were alienated from many of our allies, particularly those who were party to the nuclear agreement, and Iran inched closer to restarting its nuclear program. In recent weeks alone, President Trump managed to reverse the recent Iraqi protest sentiment that wanted Iran to stop meddling in its politics, leading to the real possibility that American troops in Iraq, critical to countering ISIS, would be expelled. Similarly, after months of anti-government protest in Iran, President Trump almost instantaneously united the Iranian public opinion against us with the targeting of General Soleimani. Iran now announced it will exceed the limits of that nuclear program that were imposed by the nuclear agreement, which President Trump walked away from, and our interests around the region are on high alert for fear of retaliatory attack by the Iranians. So there are real questions as to how President Trump's Iran policy serves long-term American security interests, and whether this body is ready to at least debate the possibility of another war with Iran. Before President Trump plunges us into another reckless Middle East war, shouldn't we first remember how we were fooled into invading Iraq in the first place? I remember it full well. I was a member of the Senate when we were given the proposal of taking military action against Iraq because of their purported possession of these devices, these military devices, which were threatening to the United States and to the region. Many of us were skeptical. The weapons of mass destruction charge didn't have the evidence that we thought was convincing. In the end, 23 senators, 22 Democrats and 1 Republican, joined in voting against the invasion of Iraq. I was one of those senators. I was not convinced there were weapons of mass destruction. After the invasion and careful inspection, it turned out there were no weapons of mass destruction. The signal event that really brought us into that conflict. Then as now, we were led to believe there was an urgent spiraling of events that required U.S. military intervention. Mark me down as skeptical. Skeptical as to whether another invasion by the United States of a Muslim nation in the Middle East is in the best interest of American national security. Many around President Trump, particularly Secretary of State Pompeo, have been speaking of this conflict with Iraq for a long period of time. Some of these are the same people who endorsed the invasion of Iraq almost 20 years ago. We're still in Iraq. We've given up more than 5,000 American lives, many injured, $1 trillion or more dollars having been spent. And it's possible the Iraqis will just ask us to leave. Think of that, after all that we put into their country. Their legislature, parliament, voted just several weeks ago to tell us to leave. In fact, one of the great tragedies of the Iraq War, one that few of its architects ever owned up to, is that the Iraq War was actually empowering Iran in the region. Iran became a potent force because the United States and its efforts in the Middle East created that opportunity in many respects. These same unrepentant voices are again beating the drums for regime change in Iran and another war in the Middle East. They do so with the president who has made more than 15,000 false or misleading statements in office. 15,000. Even going so far as to trust Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, over our own intelligence sources, making it impossible to trust anything he's saying when it comes to matters as grave as war. Some have even had the audacity to argue that the 2001 authorization for use of military force in Iraq is somehow a permission slip for the invasion of Iran. That is preposterous. I cannot imagine anyone here who took that vote 18 years ago thought that they were authorizing future presidents 18 years later to invade another country in the Middle East. I certainly didn't. The Constitution is clear. Article 1, Section 8 says the power to declare war is an explicit power of Congress, as it should be. One should never send our sons and daughters into war without the knowledge and consent of the American people. Our founding fathers were wise in making sure this awesome power did not rest with a king or a queen or anyone pretending to be, but with the people of the United States through their elected representatives. I've made this same argument and much of the same speech in the past, regardless of whether the occupant of the White House was a Democrat or Republican. This Congress, already afraid to stand up to many of President Trump's worst instincts, must not do so in a march to another war in the Middle East. As such, I urge my colleagues here to do our job and reaffirm the Senate's constitutional role in matters of war. Madam President, I yield the floor.